I was, and this topic came up, I was like, not again. And that kind of has a background because I'm invited more times than I care, really to discussions about growth, degrowth, etc. And I always wonder, is that the right question to ask? I mean, is it really growth about which economists, not necessarily business administration or whatever, worries, or is it welfare? And especially in times of a green transition and times of climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., I don't think they necessarily go hand in hand. So I think welfare can be improving even if we suffer GDP losses. So when I saw the topic, what I kind of liked is that it's actually referring to sustainability, because I think that's something we narrow down way too much. I mean, we always refer, and this entire conference has been about climate change, which is, of course, the topic on my mind and on the back of the mind of almost everybody. But it's just one, basically, of these 17 sustainable development goals. So especially in the last year, especially also in the EU, Nature Restoration Act, and etc., I think we should remind that there's actually a lot of other topics which are essential for welfare. That is just biodiversity is one of them, but also that all these issues basically influence growth. And from my perspective, I cannot really, to good conscience, say that I can assess the overall impact of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. Having said that, I'll also turn to climate change. So on the one hand, and that was nicely said before, what we of course always or many times forget about the impact of climate, let's put it like that, on growth, is really the impact of climate change. So most of the macro models, as was already said nicely, they don't account for these issues. If you look at the IPCC, I mean, it's very vague to some extent about the growth impacts. I mean, it has some headline things like, for sure, highly likely that there's going to be massive losses in Africa, but overall, they're pretty vague to really give a quantification of the growth impact. And I think that's mainly due because, I mean, it's a bunch of researchers, there's a bunch of models that they actually look at, and what comes out of our models, of course, depends crucially on the assumptions that we put in. Those are assumptions about technologies, those are assumptions about preferences, about policies, etc. I mean, most macro models actually calculate the effects of basically emission reduction given rational agents, perfectly foreseeable policies, etc. So of course we have deviations in all of that aspect. So I'm kind of addressing a couple of them now. We had the topic of technologies for climate neutrality yesterday already, and it was said that we know most of the technologies, at least until 2030, that we are going to use. And I think that shows it nicely. I mean, that is basically showing on the left-hand column the low carbon electricity generation technologies. And down below in this purple thing, you see like blue is mature, green is early adoption, and so on. So red is actually a small prototype stage. But the further you go on, starting to use that electricity, either in, for example, transport, in industry, or on buildings, there is more and more technologies which are not yet mature. So we don't know actually how they will develop. We don't know the costs. I mean, there's basically forecasts and trying to assess from other technologies how they might develop. But of course, the costs of these technologies are one important aspect, and also their scalability. That will affect growth, especially in the long run. So short term, more security, long term gets more and more difficult. And then also knowing that many of these technologies are not yet really mature, it's also hard to assess which path the technology mix in an economy will actually take. And this is a picture that was developed for Germany, where you basically see that the further you go on in time, so to the left, it goes until 2045, which is our date for reaching climate neutrality. There's a big overlapping area where could be a direct electrification, it could be hydrogen that is used. We just don't know yet. It's going to depend on a lot of different issues, on the development of markets, on the development of, or the potential to actually increase the renewables expansion at home, but also abroad. So this is, of course, all very much important if you want to basically go back and have an idea about what actually the growth impacts of this is going to be. Many of the models, we don't consider this type of uncertainty. We just think, okay, we have some growth, some cost parameters, some technology parameters, and then it's for certain that we have a certain basically assessment of the cost. It's got to be X million. And then from there, we can directly calculate the welfare impacts because we don't actually account for climate impacts or the reduction of climate impacts with respect to welfare impacts. Okay, then of course, another thing that these models, of course, differ between or have a hard time really to assess is really how adaptable society and economy are, in the sense that how do you react, for example, to price incentives? What is the elasticities of switching from fossil to renewable technologies in the electricity production, but also in other sectors? And here you would just basically see for two types of, or for two assumptions about elasticity, so benchmark and lower is, I think it was the fourth, 1/4 of the, or a quarter of the benchmark elasticity, for example, in the fossil versus renewable sector. And you see that what you assume about the elasticities, of course, has a large impact on the growth, in the future. I mean, this is just the elasticities, which is marginal changes. I mean, what we saw last year, especially with the gas prices and the energy prices, was way beyond marginal. So the question is then also, what happens outside of our realm of experience? And one of the critiques of the macro models that try to assess the impacts of this energy price surge was that they are actually not built to accommodate these types of changes. And we just don't know what might happen if we don't have only marginal, but really discrete jumps, large jumps. So that makes it uncertain. Then, of course, also the question, which policy do we actually use? Because different policies might have different growth impacts. I mean, this is just one example from an IMF report that dealt also with the US and China, etc. And it looked at 3 types of policy packages that differed not that much. I mean, they all assume that gradual increases of CO2 prices will lead to a certain emission reduction. And it's just the question what you do with this money. Do you give it back per capita? Do you give it back to in the form of subsidies or as labor income, labor tax cuts? And even this kind of the way you redistribute, not even the way you try to trigger the emission reduction, has quite different impacts on growth. So this is also, of course, an important issue. The bottlenecks behind the bottlenecks, I don't think I really have to go that much into detail because I basically talked about them accidentally yesterday already. But of course, it's on the one hand, the international competitiveness fears. We talked about CBAM, we talked about energy prices. We perhaps didn't talk that much about other issues because international competitiveness is, of course, not also, or the locational attractiveness of Europe is not only determined by energy prices and by CBAM, but also by other things, which also show up in a little while: bureaucracy, the innovation environment, the quality of the workforce, etc., the tax levels that you actually face. So there's much more to international competitiveness that goes beyond climate policy. And sometimes we forget that in the debate. We have a massively heated debate in Germany at the moment about energy prices, as if that is the only factor that actually determines the locational decision. Okay, then the second one, we also talked about a little bit, financing and investment, the fact that especially after Corona, but also after the gas prices, public finance is usually kind of stressed at the moment. So there's not that much room, at least not if you want to stick to the, in Germany, like I said, debt break, or if you don't want to raise too much debt in the short term. Questionable whether that is actually a good rule. We talked about that yesterday, but also the need for leveraging a lot of private funds. Then the support for climate policy, talked about trust, etc. yesterday, trust in politics in general, but also about the view on different types of policies. I said that, and we also heard that in another presentation, that typically subsidies are seen not only as, of course, less painful, but granting more freedom of choice and also being more effective. But of course, whether you use command and control or incentives does not necessarily, in all cases, lead to the same effect of support on policy. I mean, there's this general notion that we think that command and control is actually more accepted among people. But I mean, we had one survey, I thought that was quite interesting, in Germany about the support for different climate policies. And on the top row, you see two basically financial incentives or taxes in this case, or pricing. And on the lower row, you see command and control instruments. And you see that basically everything that's light, it's yellow or red, is good or is approval, and blue is less approval, let's put it like that. You see that really depending on the type of instrument, how close it is to yourself, how much you feel directly the impact, whether it's a tax or whether it's command and control, both can actually have a high support or a low support. I thought it was quite interesting. Then, of course, shortage of workers. We also talked about that. If you don't have actually the amount of people that you need to conduct the transition, then it's also going to be going to have more severe growth impacts. And then in the end, the bureaucracy and approval processes. Okay, I want to close, just not probably able to, not able to talk about that in detail, but some propositions on how to actually design climate policy, very general, but I think nevertheless very important. I mean, potential of markets, I don't think I have to stress here, but also the use of sectoral, regional, temporal flexibilities, I think is something we tend to forget, especially in perhaps the last years, where we got more and more detailed with our regulation, like trying to, if possible, tackle each technology possible in each country individually. Distributional effects, CO2 prices, of course, we talked about that yesterday. On the one hand, most economists still believe it's an important instrument, but as many economists believe, it's not the only instrument. So we need more. We need flank